8 history facts, 8 unlikely turns, a coup that failed on disbelief, a desert house that preserved Euripides, and a war abroad that reached all the way into a US election. These are the kinds of stories textbooks skip, but history never forgot. An invasion in Kuwait suddenly became a US Senate race story. A headline from the Gulf reached voters far from the desert. A senator was running for re-election while the crisis unfolded. In that moment, local campaign talk shared space with news from the Middle East. The Gulf crisis pushed foreign policy and leadership to the front. Voters started judging who seemed steady when the world turned uncertain. That shift changed the election mood around the race. The senator's re-election fight was no longer only about home issues. A ballot, a headline, and a Gulf map now belonged to the same story. One overseas crisis had reached the voting booth. A coup in El Salvador stalled because the president would not accept that he had been overthrown. In the room, one leader tried to make the claim stick. In 1927, a coup attempt moved against the Salvadoran president. The plotters needed the center of power to believe the change had already happened. One leader confronted the president and said, in effect, that power had already changed hands. But the president did not accept the claim, and the story failed to take hold. Without control of the center, the attempt lost momentum fast. The room stayed tense, but the takeover no longer had authority. A single refusal changed the pace of the day. In that tense room, the coup met a president, a leader, and a claim that never settled. A desert house in Trimithis kept one line of Euripides alive. Not a library, not a temple wall, but a wealthy counselor's home. Trimithis stood far from Athens, in Egypt's western desert. Inside that city, a counselor's house held painted walls and lived in rooms. At some point, a line from a lost Euripides tragedy ended up on a domestic wall or room surface. The house, not a scroll case, became the carrier. When the room fell silent and the house decayed, the inscription stayed behind. The rest of the tragedy vanished, but that single sentence remained. So a private home in the desert became an accidental archive. In Trimithis, a house wall kept Euripides beside soot, plaster, and sand. On Real Madrid's 1927 Americas tour, Jose Maria Munigori nearly jumped into shark-infested water. He saw a teammate in trouble at the shoreline. The tour was far from Madrid, with players traveling through the Americas. A seaside stop put the team close to open water in sudden danger. Munigori saw a teammate in immediate danger near shark-infested waters. In that instant, the rescue instinct came before the tour schedule. Whether he entered the water is unclear, but the moment froze everyone on the shore. A sporting trip had become a split-second rescue scene. Far from home, a football tour could meet the sea in one breath. On that shoreline, Munigori, his teammate, and the open water stayed linked by the surf. A costume designer reached the Academy's governing board before most people expected. Burton Miller was also an Academy Award nominee. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was led by a governing board. That room usually reflected studio power and top-level film decisions. Miller became the first costume designer elected to that board. The key point was simple: costume design entered leadership through one seat. That seat gave costume work direct representation at the top table. A film craft now had a voice where the Academy shaped its direction. A sketch, a gown, and a boardroom chair now belong in the same frame. Miller's election linked the costume table to the Academy's inner circle. In Transcarpathia, a ruling party appeared and vanished in just over a year. Its rise began after the Soviet Red Army took the territory. Before that, local communists were organized through the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. In 1944, a new party was set up for the region itself. That party was the Communist Party of Transcarpathian Ukraine. It dominated the provisional government while the new order was being built. Then, in December 1945, it was merged into the Communist Party of Bolsheviks of Ukraine. The separate party name disappeared into a larger structure. So the banner in Transcarpathia was brief, but the merger was final. A border region, a Red Army takeover, and one folded party file remained. An 18th-century heiress of African ancestry entered the British aristocracy through marriage. That was Frances Duff. Britain's elite society ran on marriage, property, and name. A bride could carry money, land, and social reach into a titled household. Frances Duff was described as an heiress, so wealth mattered as much as bloodline. Her marriage joined African ancestry to aristocratic rank in one household. The immediate result was access to a world of titles, rooms, and expectations. A marriage line could cross a social boundary that birth alone did not. Her name survives beside a portrait, a title, and an inheritance. Frances Duff belongs to the record of British aristocratic life, not its margins. A voice on an old recording helped shape a modern language project decades later. That is an unusual kind of evidence. The voice was Fanny Cochrane Smith's, preserved on archival audio. Later researchers and language workers listened to it while developing a modern Aboriginal Tasmanian constructed language. They were not treating the recording as music alone, they were using preserved speech as a linguistic source, hearing sound patterns, rhythm, and pronunciation. That gave the language project a rare bridge to an earlier voice. The recording could guide later speech modeling when other sources were limited. So a fragile sound became a working source for language reconstruction. In the end, the chain runs from a voice, to recordings, to new words spoken again in Tasmania. If one of these twists changed the way you see the past, subscribe for more overlooked history, and tell us in the comments which story you want expanded into a full episode.